So for me, the idea this morning is to talk about sugar loading specifically. Indeed, that's a physiological parameter that we have been working since 15 years, the last 15 years in the Vivilis company. And we use it as an indicator of the behavior of the plant and the consequences of the climate, of the terroir effect, every vintage on ripening and on grape quality and quality of the wines. So the main point of my talk will be sugar loading in 2017 in Napa, here on Cabernet Sauvignon specifically. And we are going to deal also with evolution of the berry volume, which is a very interesting parameter according to concentration, loss of yields, for example. And we will end the talk with harvest position and the relation with wine quality. So first of all, when we talk about sugar loading, what does it mean? Well, most of you already know that concept, but just to remind you, the idea is to work on sugar quantity per berry evolution, more than Brix or sugar concentration or potential degree. The idea is to focus on the quantity in every berry during ripening. So the way to access to that data is an estimate. We're working on sugar concentration of the juice multiplied by the berry volume. Okay, so grams per liter multiplied per milliliter, it gives you milligrams per berry. So how does it look like? This is the classical berry sugar loading curve. The beginning is at the veraison. Okay, berries start loading sugar at veraison for sure. And you have a first period that we call active sugar loading period. And then the quantity of sugar per berry reaches a plateau. We talk about maximum quantity of sugar per berry. And from that point, we talk about, well, the sugar loading stop, sugar loading end. And it's very relevant, very important for us to define that two period and to understand when occurs the maximum of sugar quantity per berry. So from that curve, what are the interesting data? First, we can talk about the duration of the sugar loading, okay, from veraison to the end of sugar loading in number of days. Second parameter, interesting, that we can take from that curve is the date of the end of sugar loading, like a milestone during the ripening process. It's a chronological reference, very, very interesting. Then we have the slope during the first period, which is the rate of loading, the speed of loading. The unity is milligrams per berry per day. So in relation with the quality of ripening. Then the fourth parameter is the maximum at the plateau, so the maximum sugar quantity per berry. And finally, the fifth parameter, it's at the moment of the beginning of the plateau, what is the Brix? Okay, so this is an indicator of the quality of the ripening. To give you some examples, we've been working on the average values for the last 5 years in California for different varieties. You see Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc. First of all, we can say that according to sugar loading, you have a strong varietal effect. Some varietals are able to load more sugar than others. For example, Cabernet Sauvignon is a light sugar loader, you could say that. You see the maximum sugar quantity per berry is 190. You see the speed of loading, the rate of loading, it's about 4.5 milligrams per berry per day. Whereas Sauvignon Blanc will load sugar at 7, 8, even 9 milligrams per day per berry. The duration of the loading, the big average, it's 5 weeks. Okay, 5 weeks, 35 days. That's the classical duration of the loading. We are going to see that some climate parameter, some physiological parameter like water stress, nitrogen, etc., can impact that duration of loading. It can be shorter or longer depending on the block. You see the date, the average date of the end of sugar loading, more or less it's at the end of August, depending on the vintage for sure, but the average it's end of August. Then the last parameter would be the Brix at the end of sugar loading. Varietal effect for that parameter also, but the big average would be 21 to 22 Brix. Okay. So, in the context of the last vintage in Napa for Cabernet Sauvignon, we have worked on average values. So you have the the average curve of sugar loading for Napa. First of all, the maximum sugar quantity per berry is 160 milligrams per berry. The date of sugar loading stop, the beginning of the plateau, is the August 22. It deals with a duration of loading shorter, 26 days. We have said that it's 5 weeks in classical, the classical duration. This vintage, it was like 10 days shorter. Then the speed was pretty good, 4.4 milligrams per berry per day, which is the average for the varietal. So no problem about the rate of loading for the last vintage. And then the results, at the end of sugar loading, the beginning of the plateau, the brix was close to 20.3 brix, which is a little bit low. As a comparison with the last two vintage, what is relevant for 2017? First of all, the maximum sugar quantity per berry is lower. You can see that on the slide. The duration of loading was shorter. The average date of sugar loading end was a little bit later, and the result is a lower brix at sugar loading. So, what are the parameters that can explain that behavior, the specific behavior, especially the shorter period of sugar loading? If we look at the sugar loading curve at the same time and the maximum temperature in Napa during ripening, it's the orange curve. You see that at the end of August, we have the heat wave period, and that deals with the stop of sugar loading. So perhaps it's not the unique parameter that have impact sugar loading, but one hypothesis would be that the effect of the high temperature on photosynthesis activity on the plant has affected the production of carbohydrates, and the conclusion is a shorter sugar loading and a lower brix at the moment of the plateau. Then, if we look at the average behavior of the last 7 years, we are looking at the brix at the moment of the sugar loading stop, according to the date of the beginning of the plateau. So you can see that 17, in terms of date, more or less it's in the average, okay, the 22 of August, but the brix at the moment of the beginning of the plateau is lower than the 6 last vintage. And so the explanation would be that a shorter period of loading, in fact, 1 week was missing to load more sugar and to reach more brix at the beginning of the plateau, as an effect of the heat wave. So, as a conclusion about sugar loading, for us the most relevant conclusion is that short period of loading due to the weather condition, and the consequence is lower brix at sugar loading stop. So, in terms of quality, we consider that the ripening cycle, the ripening process was not complete. So for sure it has impact on aromatic concentration or grape quality. Thibaut will discuss that after. According to berry volume evolution, the same, the average curve for the Cabernet Sauvignon for the last vintage. We have more or less three periods. The first period, the growing phase, with a pretty good speed of growing. It's 15% per week of increase according to berry volume, which is medium high. Then after the 22 of August, we have a decrease of the berry volume, and the loss is 10%. Okay, while it's the period of the heat wave, and after the 5th of September, we have like a stabilization of the volume with an average volume of 0.7 milliliter per berry. So if we put the maximum temperature curves during that period in green, we can see that the period of the loss of berry volume has to see with the heat wave period. Okay, so the impact of the heat wave will be to stop the sugar loading and to decrease the berry volume of 10%. Then if we compare the berry size to the last vintage, at the end it's the orange data, the final volume of the berries. It's very similar to 18 and to 16, 0.7 more or less. So it's small berries, but it's classical for the region and for the cab. In blue, it's the maximum volume. It's before the concentration and the loss of water. 0.8, it's very, very similar. So the conclusion for the berry volume, well, we can see the impact of the heat wave and the loss of 10% of berry volume, but the results at the end, it's a classical berry size for the varietal and the region. The last and the third point, the harvest position. We are using in Vivelis sugar loading as an indicator of the quality of ripening, as you've seen, the results on the grape of all the conditions, weather conditions, water stress, balance of the vine. And then we also use sugar loading to understand the relationship between quality of the wines and quality of the grape. So one very relevant point is the position of harvest for us according to the end of sugar loading. So we take the beginning of the plateau as a day zero, okay, as a milestone in the ripening process. And then we are going to see the number of days between beginning of the plateau and harvest and picking date. And that's an indicator of the level of ripeness, more or less, of the grape. So just to see the average data for the last vintage, you have here also the bricks at the end of sugar loading and the average position in number of days. You see that we have like early vintage, 11, 12, 13, where you have in average values 1 month, a little bit more, between the beginning of the plateau and the harvest. 14 is a bit extreme. You have almost 2 months between the plateau and harvest. And 17, we are in the average, 40 days, 1 month and a half, between the plateau and the harvest. So why do we work with that parameter? It's because we have done a lot of modelization studies for the last 15 years, trying to modelize the evolution of the aromatic profile of the wines and the mouthfeel according to that position of harvest. So this is an example of a study on Cabernet Sauvignon in California in 2014. You can see the evolution of the vegetal, the fresh fruit, the ripe fruits, dry vegetal, according to the position of harvest. That kind of models are very linked to the varietal. Okay? So Cabernet Sauvignon in Chile, in France, in California, more or less has the same evolution. So for the last vintage, the position is just at the beginning of the ripe fruit profile. In terms of mouthfeel, you have the evolution of reactivity of the tannins, density, sweetness, and for that vintage, perhaps we can conclude that you will have reactive tannin in the wines, medium level of sweetness, and perhaps good density. But the conclusion is that comparing to the classical position of harvest, it's a little bit earlier, comparing with 15 and 16, and perhaps due to the weather condition and what you have seen in the vineyard. So thank you. If you have any question.
So Nicolas, I'm going to relay 2 questions on Slido. The first one, I think you kind of already answered. Did heat affect the shape of sugar accumulation curve in 2017? Yes,
it seems,
clearly.
It seems yes.
Are there any trials comparing sugar loading with and without fogging to see if it plateaued differently?
Fogging?
Fogging, you know, when you have clouds surrounding the vines in the morning.
How does the light impact sugar loading?
So the question doesn't say if it's about light or about humidity.
Yeah.
I think just a trial to see, it might be through light or humidity. You tell us.
Yeah, several trials have been done trying to understand the impact of the main factors on sugar loading curve. The big conclusion is the most important is the water status of the plant, okay, water stress. For us, is the first and the most important driver of sugar loading. Then temperature, as we can see for the last vintage. And then the balance between leaf area, as you say, Thibaut, and yield, and then nutrition, nitrogen. But the climate, I think it would be the second parameter. But the relationship between light and temperature is not so simple, it's not linear. So you can have an excess of light that can decrease the sugar loading. But if you are in cool climate, if you increase the light, you will increase sugar loading. So we have some results, but it's not so easy. So the idea is more to measure the results than measuring the drivers, because the relationship is quite complicated.
Are there any other questions in the room?
So a lot of people use the date of 50% veraison. The date of 50% veraison as a starting point to count down to when it might be appropriate to harvest, 55 days, 60 days, 70 days. Is there any correlation between the date of the sugar loading plateau and the date of 50% veraison, or are they completely independent?
I think there is a relationship in average. If the things are going well, if the ripening process is normal, without any problems, the average duration of sugar loading, it's five weeks. And then the position of harvest is another issue of wine style or wine typicity, wine quality. But if you have a problem during the ripening process, the duration of loading will be shorter. If you have also a lot of water, nitrogen, vigor, you can load during 40, 45 days, so you will delay the end of sugar loading. So it will be a later ripeness. But in average, the relationship is pretty good.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on the use of misters, overhead sprinklers, or shade cloth during the sugar loading period to mitigate the heat spikes?
Wow. I haven't understood everything. Sorry.
Can you so the question is about what's your experience about manipulating the microclimates through misters or through shade cloth, and how does that impact the sugar loading? And I could also feed on that conversation.
You mean canopy management on sugar loading?
Anything that remediates the scorching temperature. Well, I can answer a little bit and then... Regarding misters, there is this study published by Carrari a few months ago in the Australian journal. They look at how efficient could be mistering at lowering ambient temperature. And they found out actually what is the optimum frequency of water pulses, their duration, and how quickly they need to be staggered on top of each other. They found out that 20 seconds every 10 minutes was the most effective way of lowering up to 10 degrees Celsius the temperature in the cluster zone. So huge efficiency from a misting standpoint. And I invite you to look at this paper. Shade cloth is not as clear. The paper also looked at shade cloth and found that the mitigating effect of shade clothing at lowering temperature is really significant when you cover the entire vineyard, like with Parral in Argentina. Beyond that, the effects are not so clear-cut and nothing to compare with misters. So that's for the manipulation. Then maybe I convey the question to you, Nicolas. How can you see that the footprint of high temperature is effective at reducing or stopping the sugar loading? Do you have any?
Well, just an element to answer to your question. In 2006, we have done that trial on Sauvignon Blanc in France with mist, and the results were that until 4-5 degrees Celsius lower in the grape, and we made wine from that trial with thiols analysis on the wines, and we had like 100% more concentration in thiols thanks to the mist. So that can impact, but the cost is very expensive.
Yeah.
The system is expensive.
But that's on the flavors. But regarding the sugar loading specifically, do you have any?
It was an impact on sugar loading, better sugar loading, and better aroma concentration.
Yeah.
We have a relation in that.
Thank you. There is no more questions. We'll carry on, and if questions arise, just put them on Slido. We'll try to have them. Nicolas, thank you very much.
Thank you.